I'll never forget the night it all changed. It was the summer of 1965, and I was at the Newport Folk Festival, a place where the air was thick with the sound of acoustic guitars and harmonicas. Bob Dylan was the star of the show, the king of folk music. Everyone expected him to play the same old tunes, the ones that made people feel like they were part of something bigger, something pure and real. But Bob Dylan had other plans. As the lights dimmed and the crowd hushed, Dylan walked onto the stage with a band, but this wasn't just any band. They had electric guitars, a bass, and drums. The audience was buzzing with excitement and confusion. What was Dylan doing? Why wasn't he playing his acoustic guitar? Then the music started. The bass player hit a thunderous three-note line, a heartbeat that pulsed through the crowd. Mike Bloomfield's lead guitar cut through the air like a blade. It was loud, intense, and unlike anything anyone had ever heard at a folk festival. The sound was so powerful that it almost seemed to vibrate through your bones. Dylan stepped up to the microphone and started singing Maggie's Farm. His voice was strong, but there was something different about it. It was raw, urgent, and it cut through the noise like a scream. The crowd was stunned. Some people were whispering, trying to figure out what was happening. Others were shouting, almost as if they were trying to drown out the music. But then something went wrong. The bass player, Jerome Arnold, missed a change. Instead of moving to the 5 chord, which would have released the tension, he stayed on the root. The song felt off, like it was stuck in a loop. Dylan looked over at Bloomfield, his face a mix of confusion and frustration. The audience started to react. 2 men in the crowd began to boo. Then more people joined in. The booing grew louder, a chorus of disapproval. Dylan seemed to realize that he had lost the audience. He looked down, his expression a mix of hurt and defiance. For a moment the whole world seemed to pause. The tension was palpable, like a storm brewing just before the lightning strikes. But Dylan didn't back down. He kept playing, his voice growing more intense. The band followed his lead, and the music became even more powerful. It was as if they were trying to fight through the booing to prove that they belonged on that stage. The crowd was torn. Some people were still booing, but others were starting to listen, to feel the energy of the music. It was a moment of pure chaos, a clash of old and new, of what people expected and what Dylan was determined to create. The night was far from perfect, but it was a turning point. Dylan was no longer just a folk singer. He was something more, something that would change the face of music forever. As the performance ended, the crowd was left in a state of confusion. Some people were angry, feeling betrayed. Others were exhilarated, sensing that they had just witnessed something historic. Dylan stepped off the stage, a man who had just declared that he was no longer bound by the rules of the past. That night, the world of music was never the same. I remember the first time I heard Bob Dylan at Newport. I was young, but I could feel the tension in the air. Pete Seeger, the old guard of folk music, was so angry that he threatened to cut the cables with an axe. It was a big deal. Dylan was moving away from the traditional folk music that everyone loved and was embracing something new and loud. It was like he was trying to break free from the past and create a new sound. The crowd didn't know what to make of it. They booed and jeered, but Dylan kept playing, and it was intense. Later that night, I was at a party, and I saw Dylan sitting in a corner looking down. His legs were wiggling, and he seemed a bit lost. I went over to him, and I asked how he was doing. He said, "I would dance with you, Maria, but my hands are on fire." It was a strange thing to say, but I understood. He was feeling the weight of what he had just done. He had just changed the course of music, and it was a lot to handle. He looked like he was in a different world, but I think he knew he had done something important. A month later, Dylan played at Forest Hills. By then, Like a Rolling Stone was a hit. When they played that song, the crowd stopped booing and started singing along. But as soon as the song was over, the booing started again. I thought it was funny, but also a bit sad. After the show, Dylan came up to us and gave us big hugs. He said it was like a carnival, and he loved it. He saw the booing as part of the show, and I think he understood that it wasn't personal. He was a part of something bigger, something that was changing the world. Dylan never wanted to be a king or a messiah. He just wanted to make music that moved people. But he knew that his music was doing more than just that. It was shaking things up, and he was okay with that. He once said, "You can kill somebody with kindness too." I think he meant that sometimes to make a real change, You have to be a little rough. He saw himself as a catalyst, someone who was pushing the boundaries and making people think. Elvis Presley, on the other hand, was a different kind of revolutionary. He came onto the scene in 1954 with That's All Right, and he was a sensation. People didn't know what to make of him. He was sexy, rebellious, and he moved in a way that no one had seen before. He was like a force of nature, and he changed the way people thought about music and culture. Elvis wasn't just a pretty face, he was smart and intuitive. He studied Marlon Brando and James Dean, and he knew exactly what worked on stage. He understood that to be a star, you had to be more than just talented. You had to have a presence, and he had it in spades. He was a genius at understanding what people wanted and giving it to them in a way that was completely new. Elvis was always learning and growing. He was open to new ideas and influences, and he was serious about his work. He wasn't just a dumb country boy. He was a complex and thoughtful artist. He even had a meditative side that he kept hidden from most people. He would look at the moon and feel like he was floating in space. It was a secret part of him that showed how deep he really was. Elvis and Dylan were both protean heroes, changing and adapting to the times. They broke the rules and created something new. They weren't just entertainers. They were cultural icons who pushed the boundaries of what was possible. They were the ones who stood in the gateway, opening the door to a new world. Bill Haley and his Comets recorded Rock Around the Clock a little bit before Elvis Presley made That's All Right. But it wasn't until Elvis's song became super popular that rock and roll really took off. Haley's music was a mix of country and jazz with a bit of blues, but it didn't have the raw energy and rebellion that made rock and roll special. Haley wanted to make music that didn't offend anyone, which is why he focused more on the music itself rather than the lyrics. He was trying to bridge different styles, but it didn't quite have the spark that would set the world on fire. Elvis, on the other hand, brought something totally new. His first record had a manic energy and a dangerous intensity that Haley's music lacked. Elvis's music wasn't just a mix of different styles. It had a feeling that was all its own. It was wild, it was intense, and it was rebellious. When Elvis sang, you could feel the passion and the authenticity. He wasn't just performing, he was living the music. The difference between Haley and Elvis is like the difference between someone who's just going through the motions and someone who's fully immersed in what they're doing. Haley's music was carefully crafted, but it felt a bit stiff. Elvis's music, on the other hand, was raw and real. He didn't just sing songs, he embodied them. This is what made Elvis the true beginning of rock and roll. The first rock and roll concert, the Moondog Coronation Ball, happened in 1952, but the music played there was more like jazzy rhythm and blues. It was close to what would become rock and roll, but it wasn't quite there yet. The performers were still rooted in the jazz age, while Elvis, a few years later, was the one who truly brought rock and roll to life. Elvis's first recordings at Sun Studios are a great example of this. Some of his early songs were slow ballads that sounded a lot like the jazz and pop music of the time. But then there were songs like Milk Cow Blues Boogie, where you can hear Elvis making a dramatic shift. He starts out singing in a soft, crooning voice, but then he stops the band and says, "Hold it, fellas, that don't move me. Let's get real, real gone for a change." This moment is when Elvis and his band leap from the old style into something new. They're not just playing music. They're creating a new way of experiencing the world. Elvis was doing something that was considered transgressive at the time. He was focusing on feelings and intuition, instead of just following the rules. This was a big deal because in the 1950s, people were expected to be rational and controlled. Elvis was saying, "No, I want to feel something real." He was bringing back a sense of authenticity and passion that had been suppressed. In one of his early interviews, Elvis said, "I like to do these things because they make me feel good." This might sound simple, but it was revolutionary. Elvis was saying that what matters most is whether something feels right, not whether it fits into what society expects. His music wasn't just about the notes, it was about the feeling. When he performed, you could see the joy and the energy. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about making magic happen. Elvis's music showed that the best way to judge a song isn't by how well it's played, but by how it makes you feel. If a song moves you, if it makes you feel alive, then it's doing its job. This is the heart of rock and roll, feeling the music, letting it take you over, and experiencing the sheer enjoyment of the moment. Elvis Presley wasn't just a singer, he was a revolutionary. His music and performances weren't just about making hits. They were about breaking down barriers and connecting with people in a way that had never been done before. Growing up, I always felt a deep connection to music, especially the kind that made you feel alive and free. But it wasn't just about the music. It was about the way it made people feel. In a world that often felt cold and ruled by logic, Elvis brought a warmth and a passion that was hard to ignore. When I think about Elvis, I see a man who was trying to find a way to connect with the world in a meaningful way. This idea of connection is something that's been talked about a lot, especially by writers like E.M. Forster, who famously said, "Only connect." Forster was talking about finding meaningful relationships in a world that often felt empty and rationalized. Elvis did this through his music, which was all about feeling and emotion. He was like a bridge between the old world and the new, between the rational and the intuitive. One of the things that made Elvis so unique was his ability to blend different styles of music. He grew up in a neighborhood that was mostly African American, and he was deeply influenced by the music he heard. The churches in his neighborhood were full of life, with people singing, dancing, and shouting in a way that was both spiritual and physical. Even though Elvis didn't go inside these churches, he absorbed the feeling, the rhythm, and the passion. It became a part of him, and he brought that energy into his own music. Elvis's music wasn't just a mix of different genres. It was a way of breaking down the barriers between races. At the time, music was often divided into categories like black and white, pop and country. But Elvis's music didn't fit into any of these boxes. It was something new, something that brought people together. His friend and producer, Sam Phillips, once said, "What I was thinking was, were you going to go with this? It's not black, it's not white, it's not pop, it's not country." It was a new kind of music, and it was hard for people to understand at first. But once they heard it, they knew it was something special. Elvis's approach to music was very different from the way things were usually done. In the studio, he didn't follow a strict schedule. If he felt like singing spirituals, he would sing spirituals. If the feeling wasn't there, he would wait until it was. This was a far cry from the way science and technology approached things, where time was measured and everything had to be precise. Elvis understood that inspiration couldn't be forced. It had to be felt. He would put himself in a state of readiness, and when the moment came, he was ready to capture that surge of creativity. This way of making music was revolutionary because it was about feeling and intuition, not just logic and intellect. It was about connecting with the world in a way that was deeply personal and emotional. Elvis's music wasn't just entertainment. It was a way of breaking free from the constraints of a world that often felt too rigid and controlled. He showed that it was possible to be both a white man and to embrace the cultural richness of African American music. This was a powerful statement at a time when racial tensions were high, and the idea of integration was still a dream for many. Elvis's music was more than just a blend of different styles. It was a way of integrating different parts of himself and of the world around him. He showed that it was possible to be both rational and intuitive, both intellectual and emotional. This integration was not just about music. It was about how people lived their lives and how they related to each other. Elvis's music was a symbol of a new way of being, one that was more connected and more alive. In the end, Elvis Presley was more than just a performer. He was a cultural icon who helped to shape a new way of thinking and feeling. His music was a powerful force that brought people together and showed that it was possible to break down the barriers that divided us. Even today, more than half a century later, the impact of Elvis's music and his approach to life continue to resonate. He was a true pioneer, and his legacy lives on in the way we understand and experience music and the world around us. I remember the first time I heard Elvis Presley's music. It was different from anything I had heard before. It felt raw and real, like it was coming straight from his heart. But the truth is, the story of Elvis and his music is more complex than just a white guy singing black music. It's a story of courage, integration, and a time when America was changing in big ways. Elvis was brave, especially for his time. In the 1950s, America was a place where black and white people didn't mix much, especially in music. But Elvis did something different. He sang music that sounded a lot like what black artists were doing, but he added his own twist. He mixed rhythm and blues with country music, creating something new and exciting. This made him really popular, but it also made a lot of people angry. Some people thought he was stealing black music, but others saw him as a bridge between two worlds. Elvis wasn't the only one doing this. Black artists like Chuck Berry and Little Richard were also breaking barriers. Chuck Berry, for example, took a country song and turned it into a rock and roll hit. This showed that black and white music could blend together, and it opened the door for more integration. It wasn't just about the music. It was about bringing people together. Sam Phillips, the man behind Sun Records, played a big role in all of this. He believed in the power of African American music and saw something special in Elvis. Phillips wanted to bring this music to a wider audience, and he saw Elvis as the perfect person to do it. Elvis had a unique ability to connect with different types of music and people. He didn't see color, he just saw music and the human spirit, but it wasn't easy for Elvis. He faced a lot of criticism and even hatred. People called him names and said he was a bad influence. But he kept going because he believed in what he was doing. He knew that the music he loved was something that could bring people together, and he wanted to share that with the world. One of the most important things about Elvis is that he helped break down the barriers between black and white music. He showed that these genres weren't so different after all. The rhythms, the passion, and the soul were all there, and they could blend together beautifully. This wasn't just about music, it was about changing how people thought about each other. When Elvis first went into the studio, he was nervous. He felt like an outsider, and sometimes he felt like he didn't belong. But he pushed through that fear and insecurity, and he created something new and powerful. Watching him perform on shows like The Ed Sullivan Show, you can see that he was different. He was natural, he was himself, and he didn't try to be anyone else. He let his music speak for him, and it spoke to millions of people. Elvis Presley was more than just a singer. He was a symbol of change, a bridge between different worlds, and a reminder that sometimes the most powerful things happen when we break down the walls that separate us. He showed that music has the power to bring people together, and he did it at a time when it was needed the most. I remember the day Elvis Presley, Scotty Moore, and Bill Black walked into the studio. Sam Phillips, the owner, had a vision. He wanted to create something new, something that would blend different types of music into something no one had ever heard before. Sam had a knack for seeing potential in people and in music, but he knew that to make something truly revolutionary, he had to let go of his own ideas and let the magic happen. We all had our theories and plans, but the real magic happened when we put those aside and just played. That's how That's All Right came to be. It wasn't planned. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered creativity. Sam had talked to Scotty and me about mixing black and white music, but when we were in the studio, it was all about the feel. We were just following our instincts, playing and singing in a way that felt right, even if it didn't make sense at first. Elvis was the one who really pushed us into that creative space. He would strum his guitar in a way that was raw and powerful, and it made us play differently. Bill's bass lines and Scotty's guitar riffs started to mesh in a way that was exciting and new. When we heard the playback, we were all blown away. It was like we had tapped into something that had always been there, but we just hadn't found it until that moment. Sam was the first to recognize what we had created. He knew it was special, even if we couldn't fully explain why. He kept telling us, "Let's do it again, but keep that feel." We were in a zone, a place where we weren't thinking, just feeling. It was almost like a meditative state, where we were all connected and moving as one. Every time we played, we were trying to capture that feeling, that energy that made the music come alive. Elvis was particularly important in this process. His voice was unique, and he had a way of making even the simplest songs sound incredible. His guitar playing, which was often criticized, became a strength. He wasn't a technical genius, but he had a way of making the music feel real. Scotty and Bill followed his lead, and together, we created something that was greater than the sum of its parts. It wasn't just the music that was new, it was the way we were creating it. We weren't following rules or trying to fit into a genre. We were experimenting, pushing boundaries, and sometimes it felt like we were breaking them. We were creating a new kind of music, one that was raw, emotional, and completely different from anything that had come before. When Sam played the song for us, we were amazed. It sounded like us, but it was something more. It was a new sound, a new rhythm, and a new feeling. It was rock and roll. We knew it was special, but we didn't realize how much it would change the world. After we recorded That's All Right and Blue Moon of Kentucky, Sam had to get the word out. He turned to his friend Dewey Phillips, a popular radio DJ in Memphis. Dewey played the songs on his show, and the response was immediate. People loved it. The calls and telegrams started pouring in, and Dewey kept playing the songs over and over. It was like a wildfire, spreading through the city and beyond. Looking back, I realized that the creation of rock and roll wasn't just about the music. It was about breaking down barriers, challenging norms, and creating something that resonated with people on a deep, emotional level. It was about being in the moment, following our instincts, and creating something that felt right. And that's what we did. We created something that was new, exciting, and completely our own. I remember when I first heard about Elvis Presley and the Sun Sessions. It was a time when the world was on the cusp of something big, something that would change everything. Elvis and his band, Scotty and Bill Black, were recording songs in two different styles. Some were jazzy blues ballads, the kind that made you want to slow dance, and others were these new, super fast, high-energy rock and roll tunes. At the time, they weren't sure which style would catch on. They even said, after playing That's All Right, "Well, that's fine, but good God, they'll run us out of town." It's funny to think that what we now consider classic rock and roll was once so controversial. Back then, in 1954, rock and roll was seen as dangerous. People were used to more traditional music, and Elvis's wild performances were a shock. When he started playing live shows, his movements were so energetic and expressive that it freaked a lot of people out. The press, the government, and even older musicians didn't know what to make of him. One review in the New York Times said Elvis had no discernible singing ability. Another in the New York Journal American described his performance as primal, with unintelligible lyrics and inadequate voice. The Daily News called his music grunt and groin, saying it was vulgar and belonged in dives and bordellos. Some critics even compared Elvis to African fertility rituals or Nazi rallies, as if he was some kind of threat to society. It's hard to imagine now, but back then, the idea of a white singer performing music with such obvious African-American influences was seen as a form of race mixing, which many people, even some prominent African-American figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Langston Hughes, were worried about. They feared it might undermine their efforts for racial equality. Despite all this, Elvis's music was a powerful force. It gave young people a voice and a way to express themselves. Sam Phillips, who produced many of Elvis's early recordings, believed that rock and roll was giving young people some individuality and helping them find their emotions. He saw it as a positive change even if it was met with a lot of resistance. Elvis had a special gift. From the beginning, people noticed something different about him. His early girlfriend, Dixie Locke, said, "Right from the start, it was as if he had a power over people. It was like they were transformed." Paul McCartney, who heard Elvis's Hound Dog for the first time, said, "We were like new people." Elvis's performances were so intense and passionate that they seemed to tap into something deep and primal. He wasn't just singing. He was feeling the music in every fiber of his being. Elvis's ability to let go and embrace his instincts was what made him so magnetic. He described his performances as a surge of electricity that he couldn't explain. It was more than just nerves or excitement. It was a feeling that stayed with him long after he left the stage. He said it was like making love, but even stronger. This energy he exuded was what drew people to him and made his music so powerful. Even though Elvis might not have understood all the philosophical implications of what he was doing, he knew it was something special. He believed his talent was a gift from God, and he was dedicated to sharing it. His performances were a blend of raw emotion and conscious artistry. He was a well-mannered, polite young man offstage, but on stage, he became this electrifying force that could move people in ways they had never experienced before. Elvis's music and performances were a catalyst for change. They challenged the norms and pushed boundaries, and even though he faced a lot of criticism, he never backed down. He knew he was onto something important, something that would leave a lasting impact, and he was right. Rock and roll didn't just change music, it changed the world. When Elvis Presley, Sam Phillips, and the early rock and roll pioneers created that first spark of rock and roll, it wasn't just a new kind of music, it was a whole new way of being. Think of it like a secret language that only the young people understood. In Memphis, the kids greeted each other with a rhythmic line from "That's All Right," "Ta-dee-da-dee-dee-da." It was like a code, a way to say, "I'm part of this new thing, this new world." Elvis was more than just a singer. He was a feeling, a movement. Sam Phillips, who recorded Elvis, wasn't just looking for a good voice. He was looking for something that couldn't be put into a box. When Elvis stepped into the studio, Phillips saw something he couldn't have predicted: a performer whose physical presence was as powerful as his voice. Elvis himself didn't even realize how much his movements were affecting the crowd. He just did what felt natural, and the crowd went wild. Elvis's performances were like a dance between him and the audience. They fed off each other's energy, creating something that was more than the sum of its parts. If he did something that got a big reaction, he remembered it. If it didn't work, he let it go. It was all about what felt right in the moment, what connected with the audience's desire for something real, something raw. Elvis's impact was more than just music. It was a cultural revolution. His performances were like religious revivals, where people let go of their inhibitions and experienced something profound. It wasn't just about the words he sang. It was about the way he moved, the way he made people feel. This was a return to a more primal, instinctive way of experiencing the world, a reaction against the rigid, rational norms of the time. Elvis became a mirror for his audience. People saw themselves in him, and they saw what they wanted to be. He was both a god and a regular guy, cool and confident, yet vulnerable and real. He represented the American dream, the idea that you could transform yourself and achieve greatness. And he did it all with a sense of fun and a sly smile, always in the moment, always connected to the audience. The reaction Elvis got from his fans was intense. People screamed, cried, and even tried to rush the stage. It was like a wave, and Elvis was surfing it, letting it carry him along. He wasn't in control, but he was in tune with the energy of the crowd. Together, they created something that was bigger than either of them, a shared experience that changed the way a whole generation saw themselves and the world. Elvis's music and performances were a bridge between the rational, structured world of the past and a new, more fluid way of thinking. He didn't just break the rules. He showed that there were other ways to live, other ways to feel. And in doing so, he opened the door for the cultural upheavals of the 1960s and beyond. But Elvis wasn't alone. The Beatles, Bob Dylan, and others continued the journey he started. They took the energy and the spirit of rock and roll and pushed it even further, exploring new forms of expression and new ways of being. They showed that the tension between the old and the new, between tradition and innovation, was a creative force that could drive change. So when you listen to Elvis or watch footage of his performances, remember that you're not just hearing a song. You're experiencing a moment in history, a moment when the world was changing, and a new way of being was born. And that spirit of rebellion, of connection, and of living in the moment is still with us today. It's a reminder that sometimes the most powerful things can't be put into words. They have to be felt.